You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Diana Altman.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show lined up for you. Before we get into that, I'd like to tell you about some sponsors today. Crystal Pico Watanabe at Pico's House. The Pico's House website now has a new look. She's got a team of 8 people who help provide services to fiction authors. She has a full slate of services that now include beta reading. She's got 4 beta readers now. So if you're looking for beta reading services, she can definitely take on your project. Manuscript critique, developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. Authors can also inquire about putting their books in her Book Lovers Box, which is a monthly digital subscription box with a different theme each month. It's free to authors for a limited time. Be sure to check out Crystal and her whole team at Pico's House. That's PIKKOSHOUSE.com. Thanks, Crystal, for sponsoring the show. While cape and spandex movies are breaking box office records, comic book commentator and influencer Ed Gosney doesn't want us to forget the roots of these marvelous wonders. His blog, Cool Comics in My Collection at edgosney.com, covers the gamut of 4-color entertainment, from contemporary comic books to comics made for kids to bargain bin gold to classics that will transport you back in time. Comic books are a perfect blend of art and story, and Cool Comics captures the essence of what these funny books mean to us in a personal way. And make sure to join the Cool Comics in My Collection Facebook group, where members can interact, show off their prized comics, and have opportunities to win. You guessed it, Cool Comics. Published weekly, Cool Comics in My Collection aims to bring you a smile and reminds us why comic books are fun. Be sure to visit edgosney.com today. Speaking of superheroes and comics, my friend Patricia Gilliam has a fantastic series called the Heroes of Corvus. It begins with book 1. A flight between a second-generation superhero named Red Bolt and a villain for hire named Icarus goes terribly wrong, resulting in the drowning deaths of 3 innocent civilians and orphaning a 6-year-old boy. Racked with guilt, Red Bolt visits Cameron Wilson at the hospital every night and won't leave the boy's side until he falls asleep. Befriended by a night shift nurse, the man in costume begins to disclose what really happened after the fight and why he feels the deaths of Cameron's parents and sister fall on his actions. A superhero didn't survive that night, and Cameron and the rest of the city aren't out of danger. This is such a phenomenal story. She has released up to part 4 now, and I cannot wait for part 5 to come out. If you're looking for a great adventure read that's on the cutting edge of what is in today's entertainment, The Heroes of Corvus is the series for you by Patricia Gilliam. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to go to hankgarner.com to subscribe to the show. We're on just about every platform you can imagine. Now stay tuned for our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to have Diana Altman on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book called We Never Told, and I'm excited to have you on the show today. Diana, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to
Diana,
be here.
I'm excited to have you. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
6th grade. I wrote a novel about Tippi Anderson and how she goes to the prom with the handsomest boy in the whole school, and I got as far as her mother taking her to the store to buy a prom dress. That was the whole novel. I typed on my father's typewriter, but I was really into it. I loved doing it.
I love that. There's something tactile about writing on a typewriter, isn't there?
But, I think it starts before that, because I don't know. I feel in a certain way it started with my being good at mimicking people, which was considered, very rude and all. But I could do that. I could talk like them. I could stand like them. I could, what I liked was to try to imitate them so I could see how it felt to be them. And I remember doing that from a very, very early age. And I would get reinforcement because sometimes if it was really good, people would laugh. But I was really doing it to understand the person. If they were twitchy, I wanted to know, what did that feel like to be, like, why would you be twitchy? And then you would go and be twitchy for a minute, and you would see that they were very frightened or nervous or whatever it was that you discovered by being them for a second. So I've always done that.
Well, that's I think that's what we love about stories, is we get to embody someone else for a little while, or we get to look at what makes this person who they are.
I know.
That's a level of empathy that I think comes to a lot of people through lots of writing, and it sounds like that you were using your writing to explore that. That's awesome.
But it's also the hardest thing, because it's the thing that worries me also, because there are certain kinds of people that I have no idea about. Like, I meet them, I don't know why they would say that, or why they would stand like that, or why they would sit like that. And that worries me, is that I feel like my understanding is so limited. Like, it's maybe bigger than other people's, but, for me, it's just so limited in that way that I just, like, why would they even say such a thing as that,
Right.
I wish I could just get into. Well, of course, everybody's a mystery, so I guess you have to take that for granted. But
exactly.
Yeah.
You said that you wrote on your father's typewriter. Did your father or your mother or another adult, a teacher maybe, did they ever realize and recognize this storytelling gene that you had?
Yes, my mother was very encouraging about my being a writer. She always said I should. Because don't you think that writers, they're really fun to talk to because they have a way of putting everything into words, So,
yes.
I mean, you have to be a little bit articulate, right?
Yeah.
So that's always a pleasure when you talk to a child who's articulate, and it's unusual when you talk to an articulate child. So you're reinforced, and the funny thing about it is you're also punished for it. Both things happen. You're reinforced for being able to put into words what to you is so obviously true, and nobody saw it that way before, and they're grateful that they could see it that way. But also, if there's lying going on around, you're more. It seems like you're more confused than the other people. The other people can just accept it. That was what was. But you're thinking, no. She said that because he said that. You know what I mean? And sometimes
exactly.
as a child, you can get punished for that because you're called tactless.
Yes. Oh, the curse of being the observant child.
Yeah, the observant child. Exactly.
Oh,
so I take it that was you also.
Oh, yeah. That's and you see the world a little differently than everyone else, and then can't understand why you're the one that gets in trouble.
I know. And then you grow up, and everybody talks about the point of view. And
right.
you feel like you have to somehow make a point of view. If you're writing teachers or your English teachers, whatever, about your point of view, and you don't realize until a certain point that you can't get away from your point of view. You don't have to try for it. It's like whatever you think is a little bit different from what other people think.
Exactly. After that first prom dress story,
mm-hmm.
how did you follow that up? What came next for you? Well,
I think probably what comes up for a lot of different writers is that you get encouraged by your English teachers. You keep on being first of all, you like reading better than the other kids do. It's not all, but some. And when you write a book report about whatever you read, it comes out better than the other kids. And somehow you understand the book a little bit better. Not that I was superior in any way, it's just that's what I could do. So you just keep on getting reinforced by it, and then you go up me anyway, and then you go to college and you get reinforced again. And the thing that's lacking in all of that is a way to make a living at it, and a way of doing it in the real world. And I think that that's maybe changing now for younger people. But when I was in school, it was just assumed that if you were good at writing, it didn't really matter as far as your life was concerned. You could go to journalism school, but there was no such thing as these creative writing programs or anything like that. So that was one thing that I wish had been different in my education, was how to use it better.
So when did you come kind of back around to start pursuing this, and when did it become a thing that you thought that you could do?
Well, in college I was very encouraged, but then I just thought, well, I better become a teacher. There weren't that many things that I could become when I graduated, and a teacher was one, so I became an English teacher, and then at night I would write short stories. It was always like the other thing that I did. And then I actually got a book published. My father died, and I didn't know what he did for a living because I was only 22, so I hadn't asked him. And he was quite famous. He was a talent scout with MGM, and he discovered Joan Crawford and Jimmy Stewart and Sal Mineo, all kinds of very famous, unknown actors who became very famous after he made their screen tests. And I wanted to discover his career because I hadn't asked him about it enough. And so that was my first book. I had to do research to find out about his job and what he did. And that book was called Hollywood East, Louis B. Mayer and the Origins of the Studio System, because I discovered that my father's job actually depended upon the studio system, but I didn't know what the studio system was. So I had to go find out, and I did find out that it was just that era in film history when the great theater corporations owned the Hollywood studios. So my father worked actually in the Lowe's State Building on Broadway because the movie industry was founded in New York, not in Hollywood. It had nothing to do with California. And these were all the things that I found out. So that book came out, and it had some success, and I had all of that information in my mind, and I thought, well, it's funny because it started as a novel, and it was a little orphan boy, and he's going to go make his way in the early movie business. But I got him to be about 13 years old, and I got stuck because I thought, I don't know anything about boys when they get to be 13, so I couldn't do it. And then time went by. I thought, I know everything about boys when they're 13. So I took the research from Hollywood East, and I wrote a novel. And that was called In Theda Bara's Tent, and that's about a little boy, a little orphan, who makes his way into the movie business. So you learn about the movie business through his progress, and he ends up in New York working for Fox for Movie Tone News. And so you learn a lot about the origins of the newsreels. And I'm very happy I did that research because, I'm probably the only one I know who doesn't get mad at television news, because, of course, it's all the same as the newsreels, You just have to be careful about the little children that are in the room. So you can't, certain things you just can't say. So to blame the newscasters on TV is wrong. But that's a whole other subject, I guess. So then I did In Theda Bara's Tent, and then I started writing short stories, and I started getting them accepted. So that was really nice. And then I wrote We Never Told, which is about an experience. It's a fictionalized account of what actually happened to me. So I feel like I should have written 1 million more books by now, but I wrote 3, so that's better than none, I guess.
Absolutely. That's and more than the vast majority of people will ever do.
Maybe so.
Yeah. You mentioned that you didn't know what your father did, and then when you started looking into that, you realized that there's this whole other world. Did that encourage you to know that you kind of come from creative stock, and did that make you want to dig in more and kind of reinvigorate that storytelling thing inside you?
Well, it was actually quite personal. He when I was a child, he was very famous. So, like, we would go to Sardi's or something, and all famous people would come over and shake his hand. And I sat center orchestra every time I went to the theater, and I saw everything in the theater, appropriate for a child. And then when I was 13, he lost his job. And I said, why did you lose your job? And he said, because Metro is going to buy pictures rather than make them. So I had no idea what he was talking about. So then every time I asked him, that was the answer, because Metro is going to buy pictures rather than make them. And then he died. And those words were just in my mind, because it was kind of the end of him. Because, if you're in the movie business, you get a lot of status from that, and people think you're very glamorous. So he went from being very glamorous to just sort of, he was quite a bit older than me, by the way. So he, just this sort of old guy puttering around. So I thought it was very, very sad. So I wanted to know what Metro was going to buy pictures rather than make them meant. And that's why I did the research, which I found out what it meant. It just meant that Metro Goldwyn Mayer wasn't going to produce pictures anymore. They were going to buy pictures from the independent people. It's a whole era of film history when the theater corporations were commanded to separate themselves from the movie studios. So the money stopped flowing to the studios, and there was no such thing anymore as a talent scout.
It's so weird to think of that time and how different it was, and kind of this gilded age of fairy tales, really, and the making of fairy tales, literally, and the living of fairy tales, in a lot of these lives that we look at. You mentioned this time, when children out of wedlock or whatever were kind of hidden away, and we didn't see that. And you said that you were connected to that story. What did you mean by that?
When I was 15, my mother, she was divorced, and my mother went away for 4 months. She said she had a tumor in her stomach, and she had to go to Memphis, Tennessee, and there was only one surgeon there who could help with this kind of thing. And my sister and I we weren't left alone. We had a maid. She hired a maid to come and stay with us. But that was the most sacred secret of my whole life, was her absence. She swore us to tell nobody, especially not her mother or none of her relatives from Chicago. We lived in Scarsdale then. And so when they called up, we would have to lie and say she was in the tub, or she was at her great books class, or something, And so that lying was very difficult. And then when I got older, actually the truth is I went into therapy, and then I found out there was no such hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, and that she had in fact been pregnant, and that she had a baby, and that then I finally could ask her, and she gave it away. So there was this person wandering around in the world who was related to me, and it took me years. Well, the reason it took so long to find out about it was that she wouldn't talk. We never spoke about it. She would not talk about this until she was really old. She was about 95, and Children's Services in Tennessee contacted her, and they said, if you don't want contact with the adopted person, you have to sign a form, and then that person is not allowed to search for you anymore. So she signed the form, and I did too, but I didn't want to, because I thought it was really, he was rejected when he was a baby, and now he's a middle-aged person, he's rejected again. It just seemed horrible to me. But then when she got really old, I did search for him, and I did find him. So that's what I meant.
Wow.
I know.
That is, I remember as a teenager in the 1980s that there was someone that I went to school with, that she became pregnant and went away for several months until the baby was born, and the baby was given up for adoption. And it's so weird to think back. That was, 30 years ago or so.
Yeah.
But, we just, collectively pretended to look away, and that's not necessarily a Hollywood thing, and that was a people thing back then. But do you feel like that was more prevalent in a society, in a piece of society that was so focused on the way things looked and the stories that were told? What do you think it is about Hollywood and that place in particular that encouraged that?
I think Hollywood was just in it along with everybody, and I believe this is one reason I wanted to write We Never Told, was because I really believe it's a slice of American history that will never return, and it's an era that the reckoning is right now, because what happened 50 years ago is those babies that were given away, or even 30 years ago for you, those babies that were given away, they didn't die or disappear. They grew up, and now they're coming to search. And so all over America right now, there's all of these half-brothers and half-sisters knocking on the doors of families, of strangers, who either embrace them or don't want to have anything to do with them. And this era right now, this reckoning, will never, ever happen again, because an unmarried woman now can keep her baby with no shame, and she's just called a single mom, or if she can decide to have an abortion, or if she decides to relinquish the baby, she's going to know exactly where it goes, and that baby's going to know exactly who its mother was, because there's no such thing as that closed adoption anymore. So we're living right now in an era that will never come again. And what's weird is how many people are affected by it. Like, I went to a party. I knew nobody at this party. This was recently, like a few months ago. I'm next to this man. I said to him, I'd never seen him in my life. I said, how are you? And he said, miserable. I said, why? He said, because his mother had a baby before he was born, and this baby has come back into his life, and she likes him better than him.
Oh.
He was like 44 years old. He was a father of 4 kids, and he was in anguish of jealousy.
Oh, my goodness.
I know.
Oh, that's so sad, and so, I don't know, that's, man, it breaks my heart.
I know.
On so many different levels.
Exactly.
Oh, that's so weird. It's really strange. My wife has a couple of siblings from her dad's first marriage, and they were separated before my wife was born, and because they lived on 2 separate sides of the country, there was really no relationship. And then she found them years later, and we have an amazing relationship with their families. But it's so funny, these familial bonds.
I know.
You can be absent distance and time, but there's just something special about them. And I can only imagine if you had no knowledge whatsoever, and then a person came into your life.
And what was even worse for my poor half-brother was that after I met him, I found out about him. And he was one of 3 adopted children. And so when they all grew up, the other 2 found their birth mothers and were embraced by their birth mothers. So my poor half-brother was the only one of the 3 siblings who was rejected by his birth mother. Because
oh my goodness.
I know, he tried to contact her when she was an old lady, and he was already middle-aged, and she would have nothing to do with him.
Oh my goodness.
I know. Can you imagine those both
I cannot.
rejections? I know.
Yeah, that's a lifetime of therapy waiting to happen.
Yeah,
that's right. So how do you take this heady topic and this thing that you have a personal connection with, and the kind of the sorting out of the family connection and the history and the things that you saw your father go to? How does all that start becoming this story that ended up being We Never Told?
Well, this is one of, to me, the most fascinating things. In fact, I have a book event tonight at a bookstore, and this is how I'm going to start it, with talking about this thing, which is how painful experiences turn into narratives. And it's like the ache goes out of them, and they become stories. And I don't know why this happens, but don't you think that's just a phenomenon that happens? I don't know, maybe not all. horrible experiences, but so many. And I've only read one author who talks about that, one novelist anyway, and that's Richard Yates in Revolutionary Road. And the narrator in that novel goes through so much, including a murder. And at the end of the book, he's at a cocktail party, and he hears his wife telling all these people at the party about all of those events. And he thinks, wait a minute, she's turned it into a story, and he resents that it's been turned into a story, but more than that, that she's telling it, because it's his. And I feel like I experienced that transformation from the pain of keeping my mother's secret for years, years, to suddenly it became a story. And, when I first started writing this book, and people would ask me what it was about, I would make it all kind of abstract. It's about the time and the history, blah, blah. And people's eyes would glaze over, and then I thought, wait a minute. I'm just going to say it's what happened to me when I was 15, and I'll tell you what happened to me. And then it began to get really interesting.
Oh, yeah. People zero in when they think they're getting a glimpse of a piece of your life. That's yeah. You say, well, this happened to me. That becomes a whole different thing than this kind of academic study of something that happened.
Exactly.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to that empathy we talked about in the beginning. That people want to connect with something they can feel.
Yes, exactly. And what was at stake for me in telling? Nothing. I mean, my mother has now passed away. So she can't be hurt by it, but I will tell you, my sister was very mad at me. She really felt like, she felt like it was still a sacred secret, and we shouldn't tell anybody. And I thought, it's not a secret. Like, I thought of it as more like a celebration of my mother to tell about what happened to her. More like, you don't have to be ashamed of this anymore. It's not so horrible. And my sister was quite angry at me when I told the cousins. And I think she's now, gotten over it. But she wanted to keep my mother's secret longer than I did. I mean, at one point I thought, this actually happened to me. And it's kind of my story. So I think I'm going to tell it.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that's so difficult about writing maybe like memoir that could be so close to the bone because it's the actual story, and you would think novelizing that would be easier, but I've seen this happen over and over again, that even if you novelize something, people get offended because they think that their secrets are getting out, and at some point you just have to tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may.
That exactly. Like, and there's a lot that's made up, and we never told because, what I've told you about the real truth of it is really not. There's not a lot of action in that, And if it's going to be a novel, stuff has to happen. So I made up a lot of things that happened. Plus, the personality of the half brother that the narrator discovers at the end. I thought it would be more interesting if he wasn't all that likable. So, I don't know how that's going to go over.
Right. How do you how do you start building the story of this? I know it's informed a lot by your life and the feelings that come around that, but how do you start looking for characters and building the story out of your own personal experiences without it being your personal experience?
I know, and that's so hard, isn't it? So I don't know who said you have to allow yourself to write a really bad first draft, but whoever said that, I'm so grateful to that person. And the other person I'm super grateful to is Stephen King, because in his book, he talks about how he doesn't show the work to anybody until it's completely, the first draft is complete done. Because I used to show it, because really why you're showing it is you want praise and you want everybody to say, well, this is so wonderful. But if you can not do that, somehow or other you get through the first draft, and then I guess you start seeing where you have to make things up and what you have to do, because I think the first draft is always going to be much too personal, probably. I don't know, it takes so long.
Yeah. When you're writing We Never Told, do you allow yourself to be open to alternate endings and like how does it go from what you've experienced to a story informed by what you did that and then give the characters the freedom to find their own solutions and endings?
I know what you're saying. I think that's just a matter of all the different drafts. I did have the help of a very good editor, though, and she pointed out to me where there had to be more action and where things had to happen. I don't know. I just think it's a matter of just writing it over and over and over and over again, like easily 10 times. And it's especially hard what you're asking because when the narrator is in the first person, it stays very personal. And so I tried to write it in the third person, and that was helpful to see, to have to describe people rather than to depend on the I point of view. But then I went back to the first person. I like it better.
Yeah, there's a lot more that you can do in the first person as far as the emotional connection. I mean, you can the reader feels like they're right there.
I think so too. It plus, I mean, it is easier, so that's what makes me feel a little suspicious about it because it is easier, and it is easier. I mean, there is like this thing that has to happen, which is it goes from personal experience to art, and I don't mean to praise myself by the word art, but I mean it has to transform into some other thing, or it's just a diary and very boring. I don't know why that's so boring to read that, but it is. When something's just personal, I don't know. Somehow it has to get lifted up out of that.
Right. Diana, at the end of the book, when you finish the novel and you close the back cover, what do you hope people are left with after experiencing this book?
What I'm hoping is that they will see it in its historical context. And a few of the reviews that I've received do. I mean, the people did see it that way, which made me really happy. Because it starts in the 1950s, and abortion is sort of illegal then, and, like all of the stuff that went on in the 50s, which, and I think that people, that's what I'm hoping, is that they're seeing it as American history from a female point of view. There's not wars in it or anything like that. It's just kind of what's happened to women over the ages. I mean, not even ages, over the last, 50, 60, 70 years. That's what I'm hoping, that they'll see it in its historical context and understand that that's never going to happen again.
Right. Well, the book is called We Never Told, and it's available everywhere now. Diana, if people are just discovering you and your work, is there a place where they can connect with you online and dig into your back catalog and follow along with what's going on next?
Yeah, I have a website, which is www.dianaaltman.com.
Excellent. We're going to send everybody to see you and to pick up their copy of the book. Diana, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you. You were very fun to talk to. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Author Stories. Go to hankgarner.com to find all of the archives of the show, and be sure to subscribe while you're there. Now stay tuned for a special audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, Joey locked the doors of the Washington Irving Chapel and checked the windows from the outside, making sure that the cemetery offices were dark. Satisfied, he donned a knit cap and trudged uphill to the employee parking lot. He'd forgotten how desolate the grounds became at night. A fog had gathered, blurring the moon and stars. His rusty Volkswagen Beetle, christened Ladybug by Jason, sat in shadow alongside his dad's white van, which bore an image of the horseman and the cemetery's web address. Joey swept a palmful of condensation from Ladybug's windshield and fumbled for his keys. He heard a laugh, high and young. He froze. Hello? He shook off gooseflesh and found his key. He started the engine and backed out, headlights off, praying not to knock over a headstone, again. A child stood on the hillside amongst the graves. You okay, kid? Cemetery's closed. He turned on his headlights. The child vanished. Joey idled in the drive, frowning. What had just happened? He turned off the headlights and waited for his eyes to adjust. The silhouette reappeared. The child stood in the road now, blocking his way. He and the ghost stared at each other. He bit his tongue and squinted over the steering wheel. He couldn't resolve the ghost's features, only a tiny body in ruffles? Yes, a dress. A little girl with shoulder-length hair. The figure crouched, threw its arms over its head and skipped away. A giggle followed after. The ghost skipped up the hill, turned around, and beckoned through the fog. Please come. Joey shook his head. No way. Ain't gonna happen. But he felt compelled to follow. What could a little girl do to him after all? He would keep a safe distance. The gravel sounded like soft rain beneath his tires. It drew him helplessly, past weeping cypresses and mausoleums blue with moonlight. He followed the giggle, the skipping ribbons, the little body made of shadow and quicksilver. The north end of the cemetery grounds rose to a steep wooded slope. The ghost had led him to Section 77, the northernmost boundary of the cemetery, but he'd lost her. He killed the engine, summoned his courage, and climbed out. The night air brought him fully awake. Where are you? He whispered, scanning the graves. A row of diseased hemlock trees stood at the fence line. Joey knew them well. They were dying, infested by some parasite called, he fished for the name, woolly adelgig. His crew had cut them back many times, lopping off limbs and heads, trying to save them. The hemlocks had grown back twisted and tormented. They stood as a row of grotesque sentinels guarding the threshold of the forest. The ghost climbed the slope, spun at the fence, and sat hugging her knees. The black mass of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve loomed behind her. What do you want? Joey whispered. Play. He stepped forward, hands shaking. He just wanted to see her face, the face of a real ghost. To see the curve of her cheek, the sparkle that might have been her left eye. Come and play, Joey. He froze. The sound of his name terrified him. She pointed over his shoulder. Play with us. He turned and realized his mistake. He'd driven with his eyes on the girl, trying not to lose her, never looking behind. They had been followed.